Okay, welcome everybody. I'm Marianne Jump, the Archivist and Library Manager at the Marx Moore Library. And welcome to this special panel discussion launching our 2020 issue of Theory and Struggle, our journal that we produce every year with Liverpool University Press. So this evening we'll be discussing class consciousness and political education, so very big subjects. Before I introduce our speakers, I'll just cover a little bit of housekeeping and say a few words about the Marx Memorial Library and what we do for those of you who are less familiar with us. As you can probably tell, you're all muted at the moment, and we have asked you to please keep your cameras off as you come into the meeting. There will be, what we'll do is we'll take each speaker in turn for 10 to 15 minutes, and then there'll be time for a Q&A at the end. We're asking you to please put any questions you have for our speakers in the chat, because we've got a few volunteers who are in there and we'll be funneling the questions through me at the end. So do make a note if there's anyone in particular you want to fire your question at while you're doing that. We are live on Facebook at the moment, and we're also recording the meeting, so we'll be putting it up on our website. So no need to take any notes, and you'll be able to revisit it. A little bit about us. The Marx Moore Library, we're a library, archive and education charity with a fascinating history. We were founded in 1933, 50 years after Karl Marx's death, in response to the rise of fascism in Europe, specifically the burning of the books. We're home to a phenomenal kind of world-class archive and collection of books, pamphlets, journals on Marxism, the history of socialism, with particular strengths in the Spanish Civil War, the international peace movement, and the print trade unions. And a major part of our mission is education. So we produce this journal, Theory and Struggle, as part of that mission, and put on classes, lectures, school workshops, as well as working in the trade union movement as well. Obviously, we would have loved to have held this event in our wonderful historic building on Clerkenwell Green. I'm not there, despite the bookshelves in the background. But these online lectures do mean we can reach a lot more people, which is a really good thing. I do have to give the compulsory plug for membership of the library, particularly as we're talking about our journal, which all members get free. So it's a fantastic deal. It's £25 a year and you get a subscription to our journal. Before I go on to introduce our speakers, I'm just going to invite, Mary is holding up a copy of this year's edition. Invite Marge Mayo, who's our vice chair, and along with lots of other things, and editor of Theory and Struggle. So do you want to say a few words, Marge?
Okay. Thanks very much, Marianne, and welcome everybody. As Marianne said, Theory and Struggle is the journal of the Marx Moore Library, and it's published by Liverpool University Press. And I'm really delighted to have had the privilege of editing the journal over the past 7 years, the last 4 of which have been with Liverpool University Press. We publish annually, and we feature articles that grapple with debates taking place within Marxism, as well as studying critical developments in the labour and progressive movements in Britain and internationally, including, most importantly, movements for gender equality, racial equality, and peace. And we also have a section of reviews, which has been really growing in range over the last few years. So I'm delighted to launch this latest issue. Here it is, to see it again. With this panel drawn from our contributors. Miriam will be introducing them to you. But first of all, I'd just like to thank them. I'd like to thank the rest of our contributors. I've seen several of you are here this evening, which is great. You're especially welcome. And a word of thanks to our editorial team, Jonathan White, Bruni de la Motte, Emily Mann, and Nick Wright. And to add thanks to Liverpool University Press, and of course to the library itself. And as Marianne said, if you aren't already a member, please join up, get your free copy, and do please give us feedback and give us suggestions for future issues. So, okay, back over to you then, Mariam, and many thanks.
Thank you, Marge. Well, I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, Andrew Murray, Chief of Staff at Unite the Union and former advisor to Jeremy Corbyn, who'll be drawing on his contribution to Theory and Struggle this year.
Okay, thanks, Marion, and thanks to Marx Library for organising this event and inviting me to speak. And I mean, particular thanks to Marge and the editorial team at Theory and Struggle. They really produce an excellent journal. It's a shame it only comes out once a year, but it's a tremendous resource for us, and I'm happy to contribute to it. Now, the piece I wrote, for those who haven't yet had a chance to read it, was really looking at what the 2019 general election outcome, and indeed the whole Corbyn period of the last 4 to 5 years, says about class politics and class consciousness in Britain today. It's not really an analysis as to why Labour lost. I mean, there's plenty of analysis along those lines, and I've written one or two myself since the election. It's more looking at the underlying issues that are shaping class politics, or even negating class politics in Britain today. The factors that were sort of brought to the surface by the general election result, which shows there's a sort of a disintegration or a reconfiguration, a reformation of the working class, and that is one of the major factors that informs election outcomes, particularly if one looks at the what happened in December 2019, when Labour lost a number of seats, several dozen, which it has held in some cases for up to a century, former mining seats, engineering seats in the north of England and the Midlands, following on from 2015, when it lost all such seats in Scotland, the central industrial belt of Scotland. So there is clearly something going on here, which Marxists and socialists have to discuss. Now, in writing the piece, I was partly going back to first principles, in particular the Communist Manifesto of 1848, where Marx and Engels wrote that the first task of communists, socialists, was the formation of the proletariat as a class. Now, that always seemed to me to be a very important formulation, because it shows that the creation of a working class is not something that is automatic and spontaneous, nor is it something that is sort of entirely self-generating. The existence of a mass of wage labourers is obviously the precondition for a working class. That is the creation of a class in itself, in Marx's terms. But the creation of a class for itself is an active thing, in which Marx and Engels saw socialists as having a leading part to play, and which would not follow directly and automatically from the existence of a mass of wage labourers, which of course capitalism does generate under its own steam, unaided, as it were. In fact, capitalism does an awful lot to bring into being that class in itself by destroying any institutional restrictions to the creation of wage labour, but also puts a lot of energy into obstructing the creation of the working class for itself, the working class in the sense that Marx and Engels spoke about it, which is a class that exists through the development of its own organizations, its industrial, cooperative and political organizations, the development of its own culture and solidarities, the development of its own active interventions in the politics of the community and the country as a whole, and ultimately, and not unimportantly, exists through having its own project for society as a whole, which in the case of the working class is socialism. But I think probably a lot of us, I mean, you thought when I was younger, the working class was created. It was a given. It had happened. We had ticked that box. We'd completed that task that we'd been set of the creation of the proletariat as a class. It was there. It could be led better or worse. It could win. It could lose. It wasn't an automatic advance. But I think we underestimated the extent to which the creation of the working class is a continuing process. It's not a finished work. And we've undergone particularly sharp changes in recent decades, which I think 2019 showed the political consequences of that catching up with us. I'll just quote a bit that I wrote in the article, that the changes, that the restructuring the working class has undergone within the last 2 generations are perhaps the most wrenching of all. Most of them pivot on the issue of globalization, which has both radically extended the worldwide army of wage laborers and undermined the traditional basis of class consciousness in countries such as Britain, the imperialist centers of the capitalist system throughout the 20th century. Because if we look at some of the seats that Labour lost, like Bolsover or Blythe Valley, Lee, all old mining seats as it happened. One could talk about seats like Stoke as well, in the potteries. It's not because there's suddenly an absence of wage labourers there. It's not because working class people have disappeared from those constituencies. It's not because they've been to any significant degree gentrified or embourgeoisified. It's because over the last couple of generations, the organizations, the institutions that made the working class a class have eroded or disappeared completely. The link between unions or work, community, unions and political intervention, the Labour Party, all that has been eroded, and it's been going on for a long time. Now, of course, when that erosion happens, people don't change their views or opinions overnight, but you know, a couple of generations down the line, of course, those communities do change and have changed. And so there was indeed obviously a long-term trend in all those constituencies, which can be pegged to political events, the failure of New Labour, the advent of Brexit, or the advent of Jeremy Corbyn, whatever one chooses. But there's a deeper narrative about the erosion of the institutions and organisations that have made up the labour movement and the working class in this country over a century and more. So that, I think, is the background to the problem. Now, several very important things have happened since I wrote that article. Firstly, there's the pandemic, coronavirus pandemic, which we are still in the midst of. And secondly, there's the Black Lives Matter global movement of the last month or so. And then perhaps it's 2.5 things, a half being this change in the Labour Party, which we can't yet fully measure, the change in the politics since the end of the Corbyn leadership. And I think it's probably useful for us to look at how these changing things provide a basis for a reconstitution of class politics. In relation to the pandemic, in yesterday's Financial Times, Martin Wolf, the main economics commentator, drew attention to the fact that this crisis and the economic consequences of the pandemic were coming against a background of a country that was already in crisis, that Britain has not really emerged properly from the results of the 2008 bankers' crash and the subsequent slump. We've hardly come out of the crisis at all, except on capitalist terms imposed by the Tories from 2010 onwards. Austerity, the hollowing out of the public realm, the increase in private hardship, poverty and debt, the entrenching of inequality, low wages, particularly in the public sector, but real wages really not having recovered to the 2008 level until last year. Poor housing and so on, all manifestly underlying factors of a class crisis. And when we now talk about maybe Britain will have recovered from the effects of the pandemic by 2023, what that really means is the British economy will be back at the level of 2008 by 2023, because in 2019, we just about got back to where we were in 2008. So this is one crisis piling on another. And it's evident that coronavirus has highlighted dramatically any number of class questions, class issues, mainly around inequality and poverty and low pay and poor housing and overcrowding and homelessness. It's very evident that if there's any attempt to repair the damage to the public finances by a repeat of Osborne and Cameron's austerity, this will lead to an enormous political crisis for the establishment. That obviously relates to the Black Lives Matters issue, as by every indicator, Black people are suffering the effects of the pandemic worse. But the trigger, obviously, was police violence. It's just worth remembering that there's always an argument when there's social disturbances in this country. The most recent large-scale ones were 2011, as to whether these are caused by unemployment and deprivation on the one hand, or some form of moral collapse on the other, a sort of false polarity that's erected. In fact, they are all caused by police violence, including in 2011 with the shooting of Mark Duggan. And I think the Black Lives Matters movement has underlined how, and in particular by the symbolic pulling down of that statue of Colston in Bristol, how racism has been absolutely central to capitalism throughout its entire history. I mean, perhaps in Britain, the Labour movement only really started taking up the question of racism fully seriously 50 or 60 years ago, when there was firstly a large Black population developing in Britain. But in reality, racism has been absolutely central since the outset of capitalism, that the divisions in the working class, the creation of or the extension of super exploitation, firstly through colonialism and then through racism, in America through slavery, obviously, in which trade Britain was centrally involved. This is all showing how this is a basis for recomposing working class politics on a new, more profound, more international, more unifying basis than we had, perhaps than we had before. At any event, the old working class cannot be recreated now. We have to look at how these movements arising on an international scale, but with profound domestic impact, are really putting the Tories and the elite on the back foot. I mean, the Black Lives Matters is an intensely active and dynamic force, which is clearly drawing very broad support across society. So I think these are issues that we need to look at in terms of how we, if you like, overcome the setback of 2019. It's not a matter of psephology or looking for swings in the next election. It's about a dynamic program of redevelopment of working class strength and organisation. I do worry that the Labour Party's changes are moving away from the two great strengths, I think, that Jeremy Corbyn and Corbynism had. One was the commitment to anti-imperialism, which was really unique in the leadership of the Labour Party in its history. And secondly, the commitment to the politics of mass protest, street action, activity outside Parliament, which again has never been exactly the locus of the Labour Party's leadership. Of course, Black Lives Matter plays to both those strengths. It sort of foregrounds issues of anti-imperialism, and it's also a mass street movement. And I think it's been disappointing, perhaps, that hasn't been more warmly embraced by the leadership of the Labour Party. Although I don't really want to get into, its early days and so on. But I think those strengths of Corbynism do need to be built on and developed going forward. Because the other thing Marx and Engels said in their manifesto was that the proletariat, once constituted as a class, had to assume the leadership of the nation and indeed the world. And I think the pandemic and the movement around Black Lives Matters show there's plenty of a basis, not only for the reconstitution of class politics, but also for a movement that responds to those issues and tries to give shape and expression to them, can indeed turn our politics around and seize the future. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'd like to say there's lots to bring your piece up to date. It's been a very busy few months. I'm just going to move straight on to Mary. I'm just going to try and bring you in, Mary. Stop your video. Right, so next we've got Professor Mary Davis, who's Secretary of the Marx Memorial Library and historian, and she's contributed a number of pieces to this year's edition of Theory and Struggle, examining the library's history of political education and also reflecting on the Communist Party's centenary. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you. I want to develop really the theme that Andrew's touched on, which really I think is the essence of what we're about, and that is class consciousness. What is it? How do we develop it? How do we go from a situation that the class in itself, the class for itself? And this is, I think, where not only this edition of Theory and Struggle, but Marx Memorial Library plays a key role. Its full title is Marx Memorial Library and Workers' School. And the role of education, political education, Marxist education, is central. In fact, in this wonderful new edition of Theory and Struggle, which hopefully if you join the library and you'll get a copy, otherwise you'll have to pay £10 for it, worth every penny. There is a quote on the back cover of Theory and Struggle from Gramsci. And Gramsci says, every class which has sought to take power has prepared itself by autonomous education. The first step in emancipating itself from political and social slavery is that of freeing the mind. The problem of education is the most important class question. And that's really what I want to look at, is to look at the link between the developing of class consciousness and the role of political education, particularly Marxist education. In this edition of Theory and Struggle, as Mary mentioned, we have got articles on 3 communist educators who prepared, who were intimately linked to Marx Memorial Library. The first, Robin Page Arnott, was the principal of Marx Memorial Library. James Klugman contributed massively educationally, and Andrew Rothstein was the secretary of the library and was a historian, but also contributed much to the library and to workers' education. Amazingly enough, very soon after the foundation of the library, Mary mentioned 1933, very, very soon afterwards, and actually, amazingly enough, during the war itself, the library, it was called Marx House in those days, but it announced that it was going to create a centre of a new education. And the founding statement declared that education hitherto has largely been directed towards adapting the mind to what is already passing away. In a rapidly changing world, this can have nothing but disastrous consequences, don't we know? Today, the function of education can be nothing less than to fit men and women to play their part in creating a society resting on the fullest scientific understanding. To this end, Marx House has set itself the task of establishing a people's university which will provide education based on these principles. Well, I think we should have a people's university, and it should be in Marx Memorial Library. But the point I think to mention is this, the importance really of understanding the need for developing class consciousness through consciously trying to understand the world in order to change it. Actually, we have to go back to Lenin to, I think, to get the best exponent of this, in particular, in What is to be Done, the second chapter. And although it was written in 1902, when before the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was formed, well, no, it was formed actually, but it certainly wasn't the Communist Party. Lenin said, the history of all countries demonstrates that the working class, exclusively by its own efforts, is able to develop only trade union consciousness. That's the key thing. And trade union consciousness, although never to be sneered at or despised at all, but what he went on to say was that trade union consciousness constitutes a rudimentary form of consciousness, and that workers were not and could not be conscious of the irreconcilable opposition of their interests to the whole contemporary political system unless there was an effort to really ensure that a full form of consciousness, class consciousness, really becomes socialist consciousness. Now that's all very well and good. You might say, where does this come? So what is this consciousness, and where does it come from? Well, he said, what the blind alleys that people were going through. I want to quote these two these twin evils that he talked about, because I think they're the same today. First of all, he argued against the evil of what he called, perhaps evil is not quite the right word, but he argued against the danger of what he called spontaneity. He says that the worker, he called the proletariat, struggled spontaneously, but this struggle of its own accord didn't give rise to socialist consciousness. Lenin said that the spontaneous development of the workers' movement leads precisely to its subordination to bourgeois ideology. And this is the key thing. For the simple reason that bourgeois ideology is far older in origin than socialist ideology, that it's more fully developed, and that it has at its disposal immeasurably more means of dissemination. What he's talking about there is just what we know about, and it's much worse in our days, talking about the ideological apparatus of the state and the way in which bourgeois or contrary ideas are pumped through. And actually, Andrew mentioned Black Lives Matter, and I would say that this is this fantastic movement, and it is still a spontaneous movement. And look at the way in which bourgeois ideology has attempted to subvert that movement by diverting all our attention not onto the issue, but onto whether or not Churchill should be, or the Churchill statue should be protected or not defaced, and so on. A complete diversion. It's so clever. We are not strong enough. The spontaneous movement on its own, without that injection of where it's going and the defeating the ideas that smashes. I think everybody knows this in a way, but it's a question of articulating it, because it's vital. And if we don't pay attention to this, we won't go any further. The second danger that Lenin spoke about was what he called economism. This is the theory that, well, not a theory, it was a practice really, that you could lend the economic struggle a political character. And he argued against that. He particularly quoted the Webbs and English trade unionism, where by the end of the 19th century, trade unions had achieved some kind of legal status. But that on its own only led to reforms. So the tasks of communists, or in his day, what he called social democrats, is to combat economism and spontaneity in order to engender class consciousness. And what is class consciousness? It's the material analysis and the material estimate of all aspects of life and activity of all classes, stratas, and groups of the population. Now, in the 21st century, though, what does this mean? This does mean paying attention to some of the issues that I think Andrew raised quite correctly when he talked about what are the differences now. We can't just quote Russia in 1902, which had 80% of the population were peasants anyway, hardly the same as our class structure in this today. So this does mean a concrete analysis of a concrete situation in changed times. It's not. That's one of the things that we need to think about most carefully, because if Marxism means anything, it means that materialist analysis isn't static. We have to develop historical materialism in order to comprehend the challenges that we're faced with now. And this, I think, is the task of people who are linked to the class struggle, but who are thinking about these things and need to do it. And that really is the role of not just of Marx Memorial Library, but certainly we've got a great tradition in attempting to do that. That was the role of those communist educators that I mentioned before in their day. But in our time, that's exactly what we need to do. We need to continue this legacy today. And actually, if you look at some of the things that we're doing at the library, this is a shameless plug, but our courses in relation to what we're doing in the worker school range very widely. We run a course on trade unions, class and power. We run courses on Marxism. We run courses on labour value and exploitation, capitalist crisis and democracy. And you'd have to look on our website and you'll find many, many more and many lectures as well. And that's vital, I think, for our role. And I'm not saying that we on our own as a library are going to be the purveyors of engendering class consciousness to make the working class not just of itself, but for itself. No, but we can make a contribution to that. And in this context, one of the things that in the journal is that we are celebrating the centenary of the Communist Party. That is also marked in Theory and Struggle. This is not sectarian to mention this. I think it's something that is part of the history of our movement, part of labour history, which of course is conveniently ignored by bourgeois historians. But actually, in some respects, it's ignored a little bit by communists, because one of the article that in Theory and Struggle celebrates two communist women. And so in addition to the 3 male communist educators, we need to celebrate the role of women who are hidden from history, and actually I would argue have even been hidden from our own history. In particular, we look at Helen Crawford and Dora Montefiore. These women were Marxist feminists. These women had a history of struggle within the women's movement, particularly in the women's suffrage movement, but in the socialist movement, which led them to becoming communists, precisely because of their attitude to the war, precisely because they saw that the Independent Labour Party and indeed the women's suffrage movement couldn't give workers and the working class all they wanted, particularly working class women. Now, I mention this because I think by looking at our history, by looking at past, there are lessons today, because our conception of class politics really has to cut through some of the nonsense. We have to understand that women and black people are not optional extras in the class struggle. Class struggle means understanding that oppression is integral to the maintenance of class exploitation. It's integral to the capitalist mode of production, economically and ideologically. Economically, because oppression and the oppression of, and I'm talking about the oppression very specifically of women and black people, the most easily identifiable people within the working class have for centuries suffered low pay. Capitalist profit is maintained through a process of super exploitation, particularly of these workers. And ideologically, this is important because in order to maintain the relations of production, the capitalist, very adept at this, has to divide the working class. And what better way of doing it is on the basis of people's most easily identifiable characteristics, their sex and their race. So if we're talking about how we need to understand the working class today, I don't think we can still say, we must say, that a worker is defined by the fact that he or she has to sell his labour power for a wage. But if we fail to understand the dynamic within the working class, if we fail to do what has been done for so long, and to see that groups of workers, particularly women and black people, are optional extras, we're missing a trick completely. And I don't accept, actually, that the labour movement really has grasped this problem at all. I think there are still deeply ingrained elements of racism and sexism, the divisive ideologies of those of racism and sexism, which permeate still the British labour movement, and that's something that we have to really address and look at. Just in conclusion, I would say that I've concentrated particularly on the question of education. Education, this kind of education, isn't just automatically picked up just through experience. I wish it was. It does have to be thought, discussed, and looked and learned in a sense. Education is a journey. It's not a destination, but it's a journey which is linked to the struggle, and the struggle that we all want, the struggle for social change. So the role of the library, the role of communist educators, and the role of communist women, I think, were very, very important in this. But they're only important if we can continue and maintain the tradition that I think we should be extremely proud of. Certainly, we should be proud of this library.
Thanks very much, Mary, pulling all those strands together under the umbrella of political education. I'm just going to bring Maxine in now. Right. Well, I'm really thrilled to introduce our Vice President, actor Maxine Peake, who contributed an interview to our latest issue. And there are a few questions in that interview which I think are pertinent to this discussion this evening on class consciousness, particularly on cultural politics and political education. So I'll just pose a couple of those questions, if that's all right. Firstly, Maxine, you starred in Mike Leigh's film Peterloo, and I remember I've got really fond memories of showing you some of our documents about Peterloo at the library, some contemporary documents. What role do you think that cinema and theatre can play in political education with works like that?
Well, I think it's a vital role, isn't it? Because especially, I mean, my big thing is about how mainly with television in some respects, most people have a television. I mean, not everybody. And it's been able to get into, you know, people's living rooms, isn't it? There's an opportunity to connect with people. And I think sometimes it's been able to tell those stories, and it's about experience. I think a lot of what I feel, a lot of prejudice comes from a lack of experience or a lack of contact or, you know, a lack of understanding. And I do believe that TV, film and theatre can really try and bridge that gap, because it tells human stories. And if you can sit and watch something, and we're all human, aren't we? So we can relate to it on a human level, whether it's you know, a story that's set, you know, in a completely different continent or in a completely different strata of society. But stories like Peterloo, it's making that parallel between today's political existence and experience of working people and people making their own connections that things haven't changed. I think that's what shocked a lot of people. You know, I didn't know the Peterloo story, the story of Peterloo, which I'm always surprised how many people don't, because again, it's about education, and those we're not taught our own working class educational experiences. Most people aren't. Some people will fortunate enough to have good teachers, but so being able to, for people to make, it's about being able to make people think, isn't it? Obviously, it's all about people being able to think, but it's about being able to make their own connections. And I think that's when enlightenment happens.
Absolutely. I think you're right. Cinema can occupy that kind of, and television, like you say, that other space where a different kind of source of information, where these ideas can be translated. And we definitely had a lot more people asking us about Peterloo, almost becoming a kind of household name in a way that it wasn't, I think, a few years before. So my second question relates partly to the Marx Memorial Library. Obviously, we're delighted that you're our Vice President. You're also recently become an ambassador for the Morning Star newspaper. And I know you're a very proud trustee of the Working Class Movement Library, our sister organisation up in Salford. Can you reflect a bit about these organisations and the roles that they play, these kind of cultural heritage and kind of media organisations in political education and class consciousness?
Well, they're vital, aren't they? And it's what I've been having a few meetings recently, and I noticed Hazel Roberts is in the audience. We've been having lots of meetings with the Working Class Movement Library about, you know, it's about getting a wider audience. It's about how do we reach out to people, and it's like Mary was saying, it's about, you know, the class consciousness and getting people engaged again in the working, you know, in the working class history. You know, it's that old adage, isn't it? You can't move forward if you don't learn from the past. And we keep going in these circles, don't we? And we wonder why. And I think there's a definite plot to disengage us from our history. It's like each generation, you know, feel like they're starting from scratch. And the more we can make those connections, generational connections, that we can say, you know, people did care about this in the 80s and 90s and 70s and 60s and 50s and 40s, you know, for all time. You know, people have been, you know, part of the struggle. But I think there's a disconnect unless they're telling us about the history, you know, that they want us to hear, which, thank goodness, people are chucking them in the river at the moment. So that's good news. But to have institutions like the Marx Memorial Library, like the Working Class Movement Library, like the Morning Star, who, you know, have battled through to keep the message going, and having that resource. And I think now more than ever, people are turning back, you know, to Marxism, to socialism. People are looking, you know, and wanting. I feel a lot of youngsters you speak to are desperate to know more, because they're looking for solutions and they're looking for answers. And especially with the, you know, the world events, global events at the moment, you know, and what's happening in America and here, and the explosion. And I think, you know, being able to point them in the right direction. And in one way, it's so comforting to know, but that there is somebody who are lovingly taking care of this, because, you know, we know if the, you know, if the people in charge had the say, they would be, you know, wiped off the face. And it's how you evolve. You know, there's big debates we're having in the working class. How do we evolve now? How do we open up? It is about history, but it's about moving forward in the future as well, and getting young people and older people. You know, it's about enlightenment for us all. How do we can only move forward, and knowing that victories were, you know, there were victories. They'll have us believe that nothing ever really happened, that things failed. But we know, don't we? We all know, people know, else we wouldn't be here, that change is possible, and small change is important. You know, and education is paramount to that. So, yeah, absolutely. And, you know, yeah.
Couldn't agree more. I completely agree. I mean, it often feels like you're kind of swimming upstream at the Marx Memorial Library, but we increasingly have, you know, groups of school students, young people and older people as well, encountering us and this history for the first time, and it's really eye-opening. And even if people go away and just have a few things they kind of Google, have a little bit of a reflection on, that, like you say, those small moments and changes, I think, are important.
Yeah. And it is just knowing, it's getting to know your own history, and I think that really surprises people. And it's a security, isn't it? It's a belonging, because the struggle can feel lonely.
Absolutely.
You know, it can feel a lonely place to be sometimes, but having these, and again, speaking to young people, and now we're getting really interested in activism, and I think, you know, they feel that there isn't anything for them in the past, but that's because they've not been told that there is a connection. And you know, I speak to youngsters who seem quite surprised when you say, well, do you know about this person? Do you know about this struggle? Do you know about this event? You know, which happened with Peterloo. And I remember working with a lot of actors on the film Peterloo who didn't know about Peterloo before, then became obsessed. They knew more about it than I did. I mean, it was quite unnerving, because they'd found something that had really enthused them and excited them, that was new. And to see people tapping into that is wonderful. But we just need, it's about spreading that, isn't it? How do we get that? And I do really believe you know, that the creative industries have a big part to play in that. But unfortunately, at the moment, but they are always, yeah, we're in dire straits, and those that aren't are at the mercy of big business. It's capitalism writ large, you know. Again, the film and television industry, it's about making the bucks, you know what I mean? And they don't have political, you know, content down as top of their list. But it's how do you get in, you know, you can put politics in with a small p. How can you change people's perceptions, you know, in small human stories?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Maxine. I think now we're going to bring our other panelists. I'm just going to try and do lots of unmuting. One moment. Back in. Got a few questions. We've got lots of voices of agreements with what you're saying, Maxine, in the chat as well, which is nice. Pleased about the shout out for the Morning Star. Okay, we'll bring Marge back. Right. So welcome back, everyone. I'll just come in with a few questions that have been addressed to the whole panel in the first instance, and if you want to just chip in, then go ahead. So I've got a first question from Oliver. Does the panel believe that the Labour Party is still the main vehicle to achieve the building of socialism and proletarian advancement in the Starmer era?
Sure.
Do you want to, Mary, are you keen to chip in, or Andrew, do you want to have a go?
It never has been the main vehicle. It can't be. But it's got to be part of the process. One of the key things, I think, that if we were to reflect on the Corbyn era, is to say that you can't win this in Parliament. It's a question of building up the extra parliamentary struggle. The movement is everything. Parliament has to reflect that. Just to have, it wouldn't have survived at all. We would have had we did have actually a very British coup. I mean, everybody should have reread that book, Chris Mullin's book. The very British coup will always happen. They won't need to use the armed forces. They just need to use the ideological apparatus of the state to smash a progressive movement. The only thing that can sustain a good parliamentary majority will be the movement of people from outside, an extra parliamentary struggle. But this involves class consciousness to defend the gains and to extend them. And without a movement, and that's where we've got to build. We've got to build from the base up now. That's the lesson for me. The movement is everything, and the role of Marxists and communists within that movement is critical. And that's where the question of class consciousness comes in. I've gone on too long, I'm sorry.
Andrew, do you want to come back on that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Mary. I mean, the main vehicle for the achievement of socialism is the working class. It's not any other organisation. If the question means, will the Labour Party still be the main electoral expression of the working class politics in this country, then I think the answer is yes. There's not any, I think, likelihood of that changing in the foreseeable future. Efforts to set up left-wing alternatives on the electoral field have always ended in fiasco, frankly. And I don't think Starmer's leadership can be characterised as an era yet. And it's too early to tell what he's going to do. He did say he was going to stick to Jeremy Corbyn's policies. We'll see. And I indicated in my opening a couple of areas, important areas, where I think he is taking a different approach, and I don't welcome that, but nevertheless we need to see. But Mary is right. The Labour Party, as a parliamentary organisation, is never going to be a main vehicle for achieving socialism, which will rely on a much more diverse and ramified, varied and imaginative forms of struggle. The Labour Party, I hope, will be on hand to ratify socialism in Parliament when it's been brought into being.
Thanks, Andrew. Maxine, did you want to come back on any of that? Add anything or?
No, I think,
No,
yeah.
fine. Right, well, I've got quite a few more questions here. Rob Maisie asks, how can we win on a class-based programme when working class people often politically identify with members of the ruling class that, in quotes, look like them, more than identifying with themselves or other working people as working class? This is the essence of the class consciousness question.
This is what it's all about. This is the question of how to build class consciousness. And I wish we could have a separate sort of, well, a course really just on that. How do we go about it? That's exactly what what Lenin was getting at. It's exactly what the communist educators was getting at. And obviously people can learn through struggle, but do they necessarily learn through struggle? Not necessarily. That's the point of what I said about Lenin said about spontaneity. That could just lead to winning reforms. Developing class consciousness to the point where workers understand why they're exploited, why the state is appalling, why Black lives don't matter, why the police act in the way they do, understanding all of that, linking those struggles into a general understanding of what society is like and how much we need to change it. You know, just coming back to Peterloo, that was the beginning of something. But it was defeated. And it was defeated because the state was too strong, and because actually at that point in the development of the working class, which was the industrial working class, it was too small. We've now got trade unions, we've now got organisations of workers, but we still have to do a job of work within those organisations in order to raise the level of consciousness, to see that there are connections between all of these things, and the connections, making those connections. That's exactly what Lenin was talking about when he said that trade union struggle on its own won't lead to anything. So there aren't any easy answer. This is the question that the entire movement, or at least socialists within it, have to grapple with. And the more we raise the question, the better it is, because the more then collectively we can find some more sensible answers than have been found so far. And looking at our history, I think, is a useful thing. But just because sometimes answers have been found. We don't repeat history, but we can learn from it.
Anyone else want to come in? I think you've solved all of our problems with class consciousness, Mary, just then.
Let's go now. Let's just go and do it.
I've got a question on the environment here. Corbyn's leadership recognised the environment as an existential issue in its Green New Deal policies. Was this a sop to the soft centre? To what extent must environmental consciousness defer to the class struggle?
Well, not at all, I think. I don't think the development of that policy was a stop to anyone, really. It's an essential part of any programme of socialist economic renewal, is to build in policies and approach that can help avert climate catastrophe. And what's happening shows that capitalism can't really grapple with the implications of climate change. And you see, class consciousness, if the question is there a trade-off between Green New Deal and some industrial issues? Well, of course, sometimes there is. I mean, we have these debates in my union about, I don't know, third runway at Heathrow or HS2, nuclear power and so on. And there are discussions that you have to have there. But the class struggle is a struggle in the end. It's not just about industrial workers or industrial development. It's about the future of humanity, what future that we have, and in whose hands can that be guaranteed. And to that extent, having green industrial and economic policies is is absolutely vital, as is the understanding that they can only be guaranteed as part of a socialist system, not a free market neoliberal driven economic policy.
Thanks. Marsh, you want to highlight something relevant in our current issue?
Well, I just wanted to say we have a very thought-provoking article in this issue from Richard Clark, which is looking at exactly at those questions and about how essentially it was really serious about addressing the environmental questions, why that needs a class consciousness and Marxist approach.
Absolutely. I've got a comment here from Jan Wolfe, who is our writer in residence, and she says that literature and theatre carrying good politics without being didactic is vital. Thanks Maxine and others for their talent. I wonder about what Lenin referred to as the national question and the relationship the working class has with their country as opposed to crude nationalism. Can speakers comment on this?
Oh God.
We're dealing with just small talk in this panel.
Can we extend this till 10 o'clock tonight? A proper answer. I'll let Andrew go first.
I feel we're bouncing through cosmic issues at the rate of 1 second each. We've dealt with the environment. Now nationalism. Well, I mean, the working class is an international class. It's a global class. Socialism is a global project. Even if socialism can and will begin in particular places, in the end, it's a project for the whole of humanity. We need to spread worldwide, and while there's many negative aspects to globalization, the extension of the growth of the working class internationally is a powerful and positive development. However, politics remain primarily national, and to achieve a socialist breakthrough, the working class is going to have to do it in one or several countries. At any event, that's where change will need to begin, and I think it's absolutely clear that the working class does have a sense of identity with the country to a very large extent, and that can feed through in positive ways if it creates the scope for the working class to achieve leadership over other classes in the country and become the sort of embodiment of the best traditions and democratic potential of the country. At the same time, to capitulate to nationalism and chauvinism, well, we know where that leads in terms of support for war, hostility to immigration and immigrant workers, and so on. So again, it's a question of how socialists can give leadership to synthesize the national struggles into the international struggle, because it's absolutely clear that many of the challenges that are faced today can only be solved internationally. So when struggling in a national context, the working class movement has, I think, got to foreground international issues as well.
Mary?
Yes, I agree. I think we have to make a distinction between nationalism and national liberation. I'm in favour of national liberation, not just for the colonial countries. I would like this country to have national liberation, and that national liberation would mean getting rid of capitalism. And that's the only way that when you have to do that on a national, unless you really reject the notion of socialism in one country, which I don't, I think we all have to struggle within our own country for social change. And if you say that's nationalism, I don't think it is. I think that is part of the process of socialist change for national liberation from an oppressive and exploitative system. Obviously we have to reject the appalling kind of nationalism that is practiced by what's his name in America, the president.
Trump.
Oh yeah, that's him. Yeah. National chauvinism is not part of Africa, but workers of all countries unite but they have to, the struggle to be internationalists, I think, is a key thing. And we should be alert and aware of the struggles of workers in other countries, but workers in other countries are having their own struggles. And that's, as I just said before, I don't think nationalism is the answer. National liberation is, and I agree with everything Andrew just said as well.
Thanks, Mary. Does anyone else want to come in? I think we've got a question that brings us all kind of up to date with the immediate situation we find ourselves now. Jonathan White asks, given the decomposition of the organisations of working people on which the labour movement in Britain was built, what are the key spontaneously emerging organisations on which we can help rebuild a class for itself today? Are the trade unions enough? And are there opportunities emerging from the current COVID-19 crisis?
Oh, what? Okay, okay. I think this is really, really important because I said before, I do think we have to build from the bottom up. And I think that the problem is that we've had too much top-down politics. And I think that means, even within the trade union movement, it means building from the bottom up. In order to have, active members who are engaging at the point of production or indeed the point of distribution and exchange. But I think there's lots of other organisations that we need to work with. Women's organisations, obviously, organisations that are combating Black Lives Matter is a very good example of exactly the sort of movement and that can develop. In this case, apparently spontaneously, but not really, because there's a huge history of this struggle, and really in this country, the one thing that hasn't been mentioned nearly enough is the Windrush scandal. This is so vital. It's so, anyway, it's not for me to what Black Lives Matter should be concentrating on. All that we have to be alert and alive to every movement that is developing. In the past, it would have been tenants' organisations that we had to, work with from the bottom up. Movements against fascism and anti-Semitism in the East End of London. What we've seen, of course, and that's what capitalism is so good at, is the attempted destruction of working class communities. And that means that community politics are much more difficult than they have been, except in certain areas. But those areas are where you've seen the deindustrialization taking place. So we have to look at what could be new and developing, and I think that's a really crucial thing. If it's not a question of looking at the recomposition of the working class. The working class is there, but they're operating in different ways, and we're seeing other forces being brought into struggle. I mean, for example, in 1926, teachers and medical people were strike breakers. They're now at the forefront of a class struggle. They might not see it as a class struggle, but actually it's class in educational terms. But it's happening. Things change and develop, and I haven't got an easy answer, but I know that it can't be done just in the way that we've been doing before. We do have to rebuild. I think that's what the lesson of the last election showed me at any rate.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the trade unions are definitely central to any rebuilding. I mean, despite the decline over the last 30 years or more, 40 years now, they remain the largest mass organisations in the country. 6 million members, with a presence in nearly all communities, and have it been actually getting new members and new support as a result of the coronavirus crisis. So in that extent, there has been an opportunity. People have understood the importance of joining unions. And while I would anticipate there's masses of redundancies coming our way, there are also a lot of people coming in from the other direction into unions. So I don't see any sort of rebuilding that doesn't have unions as a central part of it. But also we have to look at what is new. I mean, the two mass movements that have really made an impact and caught the attention and the imagination in the last few years, well, last couple of years, have been Extinction Rebellion and Black Lives Matter, both quite bottom-up organisations, as Mary would put it. I mean, they haven't got, as far as I can tell, strong centralised leaderships issuing, you know, sort of directions. And I think these things seed the basis for a renewal of class organisations, even if they don't represent and don't aspire to represent a final form of it. I think the other thing that helps or is essential is the rebuilding of existing working class communities, which means better and secure jobs, better and secure housing, those sort of things. If one's living in a perpetual state of insecurity, it is very hard to do much more than get by. To generate stronger organisations rooted in communities, rooted in people's experience, let alone with the confidence to project an alternative future for Britain and the world, it does require the sort of programme as a first step that Corbyn's Labour was committed to introducing had it won power. Now, we didn't, so we have to struggle on in spite of that. But I think there has to be the political action that generates real change in people's lives, that then creates a sort of process whereby class organisation has a more stable and stronger foundation.
Thank you. Well, as Andrew said, we've covered a myriad of themes with a kind of strand of class consciousness running through the middle of it all. I think there's obviously plenty more we could be discussing, but I'd like to now just invite our panellists to come back with any kind of final reflections before we wrap this up. Mary, let's just find the solution now. Mary, do you want to
find the solution? Well, I think there is no shortage of issues ever, and the question is how they're articulated and how we link them, and how we solve this problem of in articulating the fact that at the centre of any movement for social change, workers have to be there, because what society we're changing into. If we want a socialist society, the key element within that will be working class struggle, and that struggle, though, it's going to present itself in very different ways, and ways which I think are, that Andrew said absolutely correctly, they have to be organised, and the key aspect of that, of course, is the biggest organisation. It's still the trade unions. And so it's a question of how we link the various struggles of workers in different aspects of their lives. The anti-racist struggle, the struggle against women's oppression, the struggle for people who are just on the poverty line and need basic accommodation, and the struggle of workers in all their different ways, as Zero has gone, all of that, how we link those struggles is the key question that faces our movement, faces socialists today. I mean, I think we have to, Lenin said that we have to be, in order to have a revolutionary movement, we have to be guided by the most advanced theory. I don't think that we've got the most advanced theory at the moment, but I think we should be grappling towards it. We should be thinking anew about how we make these interconnections. I think that's what, in a sense, what we were trying to do, Lenin was trying to do, and what is to be done, to see how from a materialist perspective, you manage to not just link the struggles, but show that there is a link between all those struggles and the role of capitalism. Let's come back, in this year, next year, 3 months time, and discuss this again and again and again, and work out the best way forward. But but understanding there are basic principles involved in this, and those basic principles are to say that the centre for any movement of social change is the working class. Working class consciousness is absolutely key for workers to return to the very beginning, and the very beginning of Andrew's article. How does the working class become a class for itself and not just in itself?
Andrew, do you want to go next?
Yeah, well, I think 90% of the case for socialism rests on capitalism, by which, you know, if the capitalist system was working fine, then really the case for socialism wouldn't be a particularly, or it'd simply be a moral and or ethical case. But the fact is, it isn't, and it hasn't been. I mean, you know, we would probably say it's never worked all that well. But in terms of what people understand, since 2008, we've been lurching from one crisis to another, which the coronavirus pandemic is bringing all those chickens home to roost in the most brutal form. You know, the people can see the situation. The system has only worked to benefit the rich and big business. That ordinary people have basically been getting screwed for the last decade or more. And, you know, now opinion polls show that even in America, young people prefer the idea of socialism to the idea of capitalism. So there is a real change going on. And, you know, so far, right-wing populism has made a lot of the running in trying to answer, you know, to sort of master the crisis in the interests of neoliberalism. It's neoliberalism's evil twin, not its alternative. But, you know, if you look at which countries have handled coronavirus the worst, it's those run by idiotic populist authoritarians like Trump, Johnson and Bolsonaro. So really, it's a time for an alternative, and the alternative can only be a working class socialist alternative. We've just got to make sure that it's an alternative forged by the 21st century working class, not the working class of 50 years ago or 100 years ago, and that our socialism reflects the imperatives of the time, which for me are embodied in Black Lives Matter and in the environmental movement, alongside and entwined with the trade union movement and even the poor old Labour Party.
Sorry, Mary, can I just, there was one thing I forgot. Everybody said that as a result of this crisis, the COVID crisis, communities were coming together and all the rest of it, and everybody said, oh, what's going to happen after this is going to be something quite new. That might not happen, but what I think what we do need, and it's something that the chair of our secretary of our education committee said, what he called for was a new popular front. And that new popular front, I think that's something that we could go with, which would unite all these elements who've actually been brought to question what the hell is going on. This government actually is crap. They begin to realise that. There is a move and a mood, and it's that kind of bringing together. Maybe we could have that as a slogan, that we have a new popular front to combat the ravages of this system, and who knows where that could lead to. No, sorry, I shouldn't have, I meant to say that before I forgot.
Thanks, Mary. Maxine, do you want to come in at all? Because obviously, I mean, obviously the cultural sector, obviously, like you say, there's a kind of looming crisis in terms of funding and the ability to deliver a lot of what we've been discussing anyway.
Well, I think, again, there's going to be a new landscape when we come out from this, and whatever that landscape is, I think people will, you know, there's an evolution out of that and people will run with it. And in some ways, I know, like the theatre world, in some respects, will be decimated. There's going to be struggles. It will rise up again, and maybe, you know, there'll be this big issue about whose stories are there and who's allowed to tell them. And I think there will be big change. And I think, if I'm honest, I'm quite excited in a way about looking forward. I think there's a new generation now who are angry, rightly so, and I think they're quite happy to sort of steal the keys from the gatekeepers and give them a good run for the money. So it's let's see, but I think good new ways of telling stories, new platforms, and though I think there'll be hopefully a new avenue for people who've been excluded, finding ways to be able to come in and get involved in the creative industries. You know, I'm being obviously an optimist, but yeah, I think there will be good things and new voices.
But it's nice to end on a positive note, I think. Thank you, Maxine. Marge, did you want to come in at all about on the journal? Or?
Yeah. Well, just more generally, obviously not to underestimate the challenges that we face, but actually somebody did say something about history being history of struggle, and that sort of feels like it, isn't it? That our movement has always been a place where there's been struggle for progressive ideas, socialists, whether it's in the trade unions, community organisations, or it looks like it in the Labour Party itself. I think there's an awful lot going on now to give us hope. A lot of interest in public rather than private alternatives, and I think we've seen the absolutely appalling effects of austerity and running down our public services. I think the mutual aid groups, without being too starry-eyed, they are raising questions about solidarity and different, more cooperative ways of living. And I do think that young people's interest, as well as older people's interest in political education, is absolutely fantastic. And there's an awful lot to build on there. So, yeah, lots of optimism as well as recognising the problems.
Thank you. Well, also leaves just for me to say that obviously we think the Marx Moral Library has got a really key role to play in some of this work. And so we hope you'll, well, firstly, thank you to all of our speakers. I think it's been a really engaging discussion. Obviously, there's lots more to discuss on these very large subjects. And so we urge you all to join the library, get a copy of Theory and Struggle, keep up to date with what we're up to. We've got an event coming up. Our next online event will be on Monday. Which links in nicely actually with this, because it's about learning about our history. It's on historical memory and the fight against fascism in the 30s and 40s. So do have a look at
Popular Front.
Exactly, lots to learn. So yeah, thank you everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.